Do you hear that silence? It's not peace or surrender. It's the sound of your own hubris coiling to strike. Zakar's weathered voice sliced through the stifling tension of the council chamber like a jagged edge. His dulled scales, once a vivid crimson, shimmered faintly under the bioluminescent glow of the Vargan dignitary's markings, casting fractured shadows across his battle-scarred frame. His amber eyes, heavy with the ghosts of past wars, swept over the assembly, daring them to meet his stare. They didn't. "Honored veteran Zakar," High Chancellor Vorax began, his deep timbre rolling with barely concealed disdain. "Your service in the border wars is etched into our annals, but this is a different age. Our fleet stands as a colossus. Humanity? They're scattered, their tools crude. They'll fracture before their first plea can reach us." Zakar leaned forward, his gnarled claws tapping the edge of the podium in a slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed like distant thunder. His other hand rested on the worn grip of his ceremonial staff, a relic more emblematic than practical now, much like the weight of his words in their eyes. "Do you think they'll fight as you predict?" Zakar's tone dipped, rough as gravel yet threaded with a quiet menace. "That they'll line up neatly, waiting for your mercy? Have you erased the memory of Clyon Verge? Or are your archives too pristine to hold the echoes of our ships burning when their scrap heaps turned into spears?" His claw jabbed the podium, punctuating each challenge. The chamber tightened around him, the air thick with the subtle tang of heated alloys from overworked laser plasma displays and the earthy undertone of circulated oxygen strained by too many breaths. Zakar's nostrils flared, catching the sharp bite of synthetic polish wafting from the council's polished robes, a stark contrast to the blood and dust scent of his memories. Vorax barked a laugh, short and hollow, his towering frame shifting forward. "Clyon Verge was generations ago, Zakar. We've outgrown those setbacks. Our shields alone? We'll buckle," Zakar cut in, slamming his claw flat against the podium. The impact rang out like a gunshot, sharp and final. "Those shields will crack, your lines will splinter, and your strategies will dissolve the instant a human freighter unloads a payload to shatter a moon. And it will, because that's their nature. They twist the laws you cling to." The room stilled, the only sound the soft rustle of fabric as a junior aide shifted uncomfortably near the chamber's edge. It wasn't the Vargan's arsenal Zakar dreaded. It was humanity's refusal to bow, their knack for turning order into chaos. High Chancellor Vorax rose, his imposing silhouette dominating the space, his voice icy with authority. "Enough, veteran. Your fears are recorded." His luminous eyes gleamed like twin embers as he settled back, claws steepled. "But we've surpassed the crude skirmishes of your time. Your caution reeks of stagnation." Zakar straightened, his posture rigid, but far from defeated. His mandibles clicked once, a restrained snap of frustration. "You're crafting a conquest. They'll make it a slaughter." Vorax's stare turned flinty. "You're dismissed, Zakar." Zakar rose with measured slowness, his wiry frame casting a long shadow under the chamber's stark illumination. His scales, muted and cracked from decades of combat, rasped faintly against his robes as he moved. At the threshold, he paused, his gravelly voice reverberating back. "When they turn your wreckage into traps, don't say I didn't try." The heavy doors sealed behind him with a dull clang, leaving the council in a charged hush. Zakar's quarters were a Spartan contrast to the council's opulence, the bare walls lined with heads-up displays flickering with muted battle logs, a silent testament to every lesson carved in sacrifice. He stood before the largest display, its grainy feed replaying a human outpost's defiance during the border wars. The screen stuttered as a ramshackle craft ignited, tearing through a Vargan cruiser like a blade through flesh. The air carried the faint bite of recycled coolant, a reminder of the aging systems that kept his small sanctuary functional. Zakar traced a claw over the display's edge, his thoughts not on the blast, but on the humans' faces before it, unyielding, resolute. Brooding again? A voice broke the stillness. Zakar turned to find Commander Krell in the doorway, his lean frame silhouetted against the corridor's dim glow. Krell's scales gleamed faintly, still vibrant with youth, and he carried a data slate, its soft light casting a sheen across his features. "They're blind, Krell," Zakar said without preamble, his tone weary but firm. "They think power wins wars. It doesn't. Will does. Instinct does." Krell set the slate down with a quiet clack, his movements careful. "You've been shouting into the void for years. They won't hear you. Not until the sky falls." Zakar's antennae twitched faintly as he studied his old comrade. "Do you think they'll triumph?" "No," Krell replied, his voice measured. "But I don't think they'll lose the way Vorax expects. Humans don't break cleanly. They drag you into the mire and make you claw for every breath." Zakar let out a low, bitter chuckle. "You're starting to echo me?" "Someone has to," Krell murmured, his markings dimming slightly in the shadowed room. Before Zakar could respond, a low tremor pulsed through the station, a deep, resonant thud that set his scales on edge, the kind of signal that meant the fleet was mobilizing. At the observation bay, the void stretched cold and unbroken, the distant stars mere pinpricks against the dark. Zakar stood alone, watching the Vargan fleet assemble in the distance. Hundreds of ships gleamed faintly, their angular forms cutting through the blackness like talons poised to strike. Krell joined him, his usual grace tempered by a stiffness that betrayed his unease. "They're certain of victory. The fleet's the mightiest we've ever mustered." "Certainty's the first thing war devours," Zakar muttered. The bay vibrated faintly as the ships ignited their drives, the sound a distant pulse that thrummed in his chest. His sharp hearing caught the muted chatter of officers across the bay's comms, their voices bright with anticipation. Zakar's focus lingered on a cluster of ships, Vorax's vanguard, bristling with cutting-edge weaponry. He knew their intent: crush humanity in a single, overwhelming blow. But he also saw the weakness. He pressed a claw against the cold glass, grounding himself. "They've no idea what's waiting," he said, barely above a whisper. "And if they did?" Krell asked, curiosity threading his tone. Zakar's claws flexed faintly. "They'd still charge in? That's the folly of pride." As the fleet surged into the dark, a familiar weight settled in Zakar's chest, the same he'd felt commanding his own ill-fated campaigns against humanity. He glanced at Krell, who met his gaze but held his silence. Turning from the view, Zakar rasped, "Ready my shuttle." "If they weather the first clash, someone'll need to salvage what's left." Krell paused. "You think it'll come to that?" Zakar's eyes drifted back to the stars, his face a mask. "Number." "It'll be worse." Zakar's shuttle drifted away from the observation bay, its sleek hull a muted gleam against the void's unyielding dark. Inside, the cabin reflected his weathered form in every polished surface, his dulled scales catching the faint light of the controls. He watched the Vargan fleet vanish into the distance, their angular silhouettes merging with the shadows of space. A predator's march toward a prey they couldn't comprehend. His chest tightened, not with awe, but with the bitter certainty of what lay ahead. "They stride like gods," Zakar muttered, his voice a low rasp. Beside him, Commander Krell adjusted the shuttle's course, his claws moving with quiet efficiency over the console. "Pride can be a blade, Zakar. Wielded well, it cuts the foe before they strike." Zakar turned slowly, his amber eyes narrowing. "Pride's a crutch for the reckless. It'll snap under the first blow and they'll be scrambling by then." His claw brushed the worn staff propped against his seat, its scars a silent echo of his words. You've seen the records. You know what happens when humans bleed. Krell paused, his markings dimming faintly in the cabin's soft glow. They endure. No. Zakar's tone was unyielding, sharp as a blade's edge. They thrive. Endurance is survival. Thriving is defiance, and humans feast on defiance. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint pulse of the shuttle's stabilizers thrumming through the floor. Zakar's gaze drifted to the viewport, his mind racing across the light years to the fleet's doomed path. He could almost taste the tension brewing, decisions hardening, plans locking into place, a fragile web waiting to tear. The shuttle's interior carried the subtle bite of recycled air, tinged with the dry warmth of overtaxed circuits. Zakar leaned back, his scales rasping against the seat as he steepled his claws. They're blind to it, Krell. They see numbers, ships, shields, not the will behind them. Krell's mandibles twitched faintly, his focus split between the controls and Zakar's words. And you think we can shift the tide? Us? Alone? Not alone, Zakar snapped, his voice cutting through the stillness. We've got old debts to call in. On Earth, far from the Vargan's gleaming armada, the air was thick with the tang of scorched earth and the faint hiss of cooling machinery. Admiral Elena Voss stood in the heart of her command center, her boots planted firm on a floor scuffed by years of relentless pacing. Around her, officers moved with quiet urgency, their faces illuminated by the shifting light of laser plasma displays tracking the Vargan fleet's advance. They're coming, Voss murmured, her voice steady but edged with steel. Her sharp eyes darted across the heads-up display, cataloging every blip of the encroaching enemy. Lieutenant Chen, a wiry figure at her side, adjusted a data feed with quick, deft motions. Intel's been trickling in for weeks, Admiral. They're not subtle about it. Good, Voss replied, folding her arms. Subtlety's overrated when you're dealing with arrogance. The room buzzed with the low murmur of overlapping voices, the air heavy with the scent of sweat and synthetic coffee, a brew strong enough to keep exhaustion at bay. Voss's gaze lingered on a cluster of markers, outer colonies, ripe for the Vargan's first strike. She'd spent years fortifying those edges, weaving a net of defenses and alliances with species who'd tasted Vargan oppression firsthand. "Get me the Clitherans," she ordered, her tone clipped. "And the Dornai. If the Vargan want to fight, they'll get more than they bargained for." Chen nodded, his fingers flying over the console. "Channels open in 5. Back in the shuttle, Zakar activated a secure comms link, the faint crackle of static filling the cabin as the signal reached out. Krell glanced over, his expression unreadable. "You're betting on ghosts, Zakar. The Clitherans haven't answered us since the Verge." "Then we make them listen," Zakar growled, leaning into the comms unit. "This is Zakar, Vargan 3rd Legion, retired. I'm calling on the Pact of Clyon Verge. You owe us, me, a debt. Humanity's about to pay for your silence." The line hissed for a moment before a voice, reedy and cautious, broke through. "Zakar? By the storms, you're still alive?" "Barely," Zakar shot back, his mandibles clicking once. "The Vargan fleet's moving on human space. You know what that means." A pause, then the voice hardened. "We've no love for your empire, old scale. Why should we care?" "Because humans don't forget," Zakar said, his tone dropping low. "And when they win, and they will, they'll remember who stood by. You want their gratitude or their grudge?" The silence stretched, thick with unspoken calculations. Finally, the Clitheran replied, "We'll consider it. What are the coordinates?" "Sending now," Zakar said, nodding to Krell, who relayed the data with a flick of his claws. As the link cut off, Krell's markings flared briefly. "That's one. The Dornai won't be so easy. They'll bend, Zakar muttered, his eyes narrowing. They always do when the fire gets close. The shuttle trembled faintly as it adjusted its trajectory, the distant pulse of its engines a steady beat against the quiet. Zakar's thoughts churned, not just on the Vargan's folly, but on the fragile threads he was pulling together. Old allies, bitter grudges, a patchwork of resistance that might just hold. On Earth, Voss received the first response from the Clitherans, a tentative agreement, laced with conditions. She allowed herself a faint smirk, her fingers tapping the edge of her console. "One down," she said to Chen, who offered a quick nod. "Dornai's on the line," he replied, his voice low but steady. "They're skeptical." "Let me talk to them," Voss said, stepping forward. Her voice sharpened as the comms crackled to life. "This is Admiral Voss, Earth Defense Forces. The Vargan are coming for us, and you're next if we fall. You want to sit this out, or you want to say in what's left?" The Dornai commander's reply was slow, gravelly with suspicion. "Your kind always promises ruin, human. Why trust you now?" "Because we've got skin in this," Voss shot back, her words like a whip crack. "You've seen what the Vargan do to worlds they claim. Help us, and we'll keep them off your doorstep." Another pause, then a grudging, "We'll send scouts." No promises. "Good enough," Voss said, cutting the link. She turned to Chen, her expression flinty. "Get the outer garrisons ready. They'll hit hard and fast." Chen hesitated, his brow furrowing faintly. "You think Zakar's intel is solid?" "I think he's desperate," Voss replied, her gaze drifting to the display. "And desperate men don't lie." In the shuttle, Zakar leaned back, the faint warmth of the seat seeping into his scales. The heads-up display flickered with updates, Clitheran ships mobilizing, Dornai scouts on the move. It wasn't an army, not yet, but it was a start. "They're stirring," Krell said, his tone cautious. "But it's thin. If the Vargan break through, they won't," Zakar interrupted, his voice hard. "Not if we play this right." Krell's eyes flicked to him, a question lingering unspoken. Zakar ignored it, his focus locked on the void ahead. The fleet was moving, the humans were rising, and the old alliances were creaking back to life. He could feel the tension building, a storm not of wind, but of will. "Set course for the outer rim," Zakar rasped. "We've got work to do." Krell nodded, his claws tapping the controls. "And if it's not enough?" Zakar's mandibles twitched, his gaze unyielding. "Then we make it enough." Zakar's shuttle slipped through the void like a shadow, its hull a dull shimmer against the star-strewn dark. Inside, the cabin was a cocoon of muted light, the glow of the heads-up displays casting jagged reflections across his weathered scales. He stared out the viewport, the Vargan fleet now a distant cluster of glinting talons, slicing toward human space. His claws tightened around his staff, the worn grip grounding him as Krell's words echoed in his skull. "And if it's not enough?" "Then we make it enough," Zakar had said, but the weight of that vow gnawed at him now, sharp as a blade against bone. "They're locked on course," Krell murmured, his voice low as he tapped the controls. His markings flickered faintly, betraying the tension beneath his calm. "No hesitation. They're betting everything on this strike." Zakar's mandibles clicked once, a dry snap in the stillness. "They're betting on a ghost. Humanity's not the prey they think." Krell glanced over, his claws pausing mid-motion. "You're sure of that?" "No." Zakar's tone was rough, unpolished. "But I've seen them turn traps into victories. That's enough to wager on." The shuttle's interior thrummed faintly, the subtle vibration of its drives pulsing through the floor. The air carried the dry bite of overworked filters, laced with the faint warmth of strained wiring, a reminder of their fragile lifeline in the black. Zakar's gaze flicked to the laser plasma display, its shifting markers tracking the Vargan fleet's relentless advance. He could feel the threads of his plan tightening, old allies rousing, humans arming, a fragile defiance taking shape. Aboard the Vargan flagship, Eclipse of Dominion, High Chancellor Vorax stood at the heart of the command deck, his towering frame a pillar amid the flurry of officers. The air was thick with the tang of heated alloys and the sharp whiff of synthetic lubricants. The machinery pushed hard to keep the fleet's pace. His luminous eyes swept the heads-up displays, each screen alive with data feeds painting a picture of inevitable triumph. "Status," Vorax demanded, his voice a deep rumble that cut through the overlapping chatter. Commander Trelk, a lean figure with scales still bright from youth, straightened at his station. "We've entered Phase 1, Chancellor. Scouts report thin human presence along their outer rim. Their defenses are patchwork, crude guns, outdated shields, no sign of a counterforce." Vorax's mandibles twitched in what might have been satisfaction. "As expected." "They cling to relics. How long until the Vanguard reaches strike range?" "3 cycles," Trelk replied, his tone steady but eager. "We'll secure the perimeter and lock their colonies in a chokehold." "Flawless," Vorax said, his claws tapping the console's edge in a slow, deliberate rhythm. "This will be swift. By the time they scream, we'll own their skies." Trelk allowed a faint glow to flare in his markings, a flicker of pride. "Their tactics haven't shifted since the border wars. They're no match." No match. The phrase lingered in Vorax's mind, a quiet itch he brushed aside. The data was ironclad, the fleet unmatched. Zakar's warnings were dust, old scars from a faded era, irrelevant against their might. Unseen by them on Earth's outer rim, a human command post hummed with quiet defiance. Buried beneath a scarred moon's surface, the room glowed with the shifting light of laser plasma displays, their feeds tracking the Vargan approach. The air was heavy with the earthy scent of packed soil and the faint hiss of coolant lines threading through the walls. Admiral Elena Voss paced the cramped space, her sharp eyes locked on the enemy markers creeping closer. "They're bold," she muttered, her voice a low blade. Lieutenant Chen hovered nearby, his wiry frame bent over a console as he adjusted signal outputs. "They're not even cloaking their approach, Admiral. It's like they want us to see." "Then they'll regret it," Voss shot back, her tone cutting through the room's tension. "What's the status on our line?" "Garrisons are live," Chen said, his fingers deft on the controls. "Clitheran scouts are in position, Dornai ships trailing. It's a thin net, but it's holding." Voss nodded, her arms folding tight across her chest. "Thin's all we need. For now." The command post buzzed with the murmur of overlapping voices, the air tinged with the bitter edge of overbrewed rations keeping the crew sharp. Voss's gaze lingered on a cluster of markers, her outer defenses, a mix of human ingenuity and alien grit. She'd woven this web over years, threading alliances with the Clitheran's stealth and the Dornay's stubborn bulk. It wasn't a wall, it was a snare. Back in the shuttle, Zakar activated a back-channel link, the faint crackle of static cutting through the cabin's quiet. Krell adjusted their course, his claws tapping lightly as he listened. "You're pushing hard," he said, his voice soft but pointed. "Hard's all we've got," Zakar rasped, leaning into the comms. "Voss, this is Zakar. Your rim's about to take the hit. What's your play?" The line hissed before Voss's voice broke through, steady and sharp. "We're ready, old scale. Defenses are up, allies in tow. You got anything for me?" "Plenty," Zakar said, his tone dropping low. "Their vanguard's brittle, fast but rigid. Hit them with chaos, not force. They'll stumble." "Chaos is my specialty," Voss replied, a faint edge of a smirk in her words. "You're on their side of the line. Anything else?" Zakar's claws flexed against the staff. "Their comms lag on the left flank. Exploit it. I'll feed you more as it breaks." "Done," Voss said, the link cutting with a snap. Krell's markings dimmed slightly, his gaze flicking to Zakar. "You're gambling with scraps." "Scraps are what humans turn into knives," Zakar muttered, his eyes narrowing at the display. The Vargan fleet loomed larger now, a predator closing on its mark. He could feel the tension coiling, not a storm, but a trap springing shut. On the eclipse of dominion, Vorax watched the vanguard peel off, their sleek forms diving toward the human rim. The command deck thrummed with the pulse of overtaxed systems, the air sharp with the scent of heated circuits. "First blood," he murmured, his voice a low growl of triumph. Trelk stood at his side, his posture stiff with anticipation. "They'll scatter under the barrage, Chancellor. It's already over." "Over?" Vorax's eyes gleamed, his claws tapping faster. "Number, it's just begun." Below, Voss's command post braced for impact. The heads-up display flared with alerts as the Vargan vanguard closed in, their intent clear. She turned to Chen, her voice a whip crack. "Signal the line. Hold fire until they're deep. Let them think they've won." Chen nodded, his hands flying over the console. "Clitherans and Dorne are synced. Waiting on your word." "Good," Voss said, her gaze locked on the approaching fleet. "They'll charge in blind. We'll make them pay for it." In the shuttle, Zakar watched the same markers converge, his chest tight with a mix of dread and resolve. "It's starting," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Krell's claws stilled on the controls, his tone cautious. "And if they adapt?" Zakar's mandibles twitched, his amber eyes unyielding. "They won't. Not fast enough." Zakar's shuttle hung at the edge of the fray, its sleek shell a faint glint against the void's unrelenting black. Inside, the cabin was awash in the shifting glow of laser plasma displays, their light dancing across his dulled scales. He watched the Vargan vanguard descend on the human outpost, a swarm of talons poised to rend flesh from bone. His mandibles twitched, a faint click slicing through the quiet as Krell's question lingered. "And if they adapt?" "They won't. Not fast enough," Zakar had rasped. But now, with the clash igniting, doubt gnawed at the edges of his certainty. "They're in deep," Krell muttered, his claws hovering over the controls. His markings flickered, a subdued pulse of unease. "The humans are holding back. Why?" Zakar's amber eyes narrowed, locked on the display. "Because they're not fighting yet. They're baiting." The shuttle vibrated faintly, the dull thrum of its stabilizers reverberating through the floor. The air carried the dry sting of overheated circuits, mingled with the earthy undertone of recycled oxygen stretched thin. Zakar's claws gripped his staff, the worn wood a tether as he tracked the Vargan ships plunging into the trap he'd warned them about. Aboard the Eclipse of Dominion, High Chancellor Vorax stood rigid on the command deck, his luminous gaze fixed on the heads-up displays. The air was thick with the sharp tang of scorched wiring and the faint hiss of coolant vents straining under the load. His vanguard tore toward the human outpost, a remote speck on their charts, expecting a brittle shell to crack beneath their might. "Engage!" Vorax ordered, his voice a low growl slicing through the chatter. Commander Trelk leaned forward, his scales glinting in the deck's stark light. "Weapons locked, Chancellor. Their defenses are silent. Scanners show static emplacements, no movement." Vorax's claws tapped the console, a slow rhythm of anticipation. "Then they're already broken. Crush them." The vanguard unleashed its salvo, beams of searing energy lancing through the dark to rake the outpost's surface. The deck thrummed with the pulse of discharged power, the air sharpening with the bite of overheated alloys. Trelk's markings flared briefly, a flicker of triumph. "Direct hits. They're dust." "Dust doesn't fight," Vorax murmured, his eyes narrowing at the display. Something tugged at him, an itch, a shadow of Zakar's voice whispering through his skull. He brushed it aside. Below, on the scarred crust of the human outpost, the silence shattered. Hidden gun emplacements roared to life, their barrels spitting a storm of projectiles that streaked upward like vengeful specters. The air inside the buried command post was heavy with the gritty scent of packed earth and the faint crackle of static from overtaxed comms. Admiral Elena Voss stood at the center, her boots scuffing the worn floor as she watched the Vargan ships falter on the laser plasma display. "Now!" she snapped, her voice a whip crack through the room. Lieutenant Chen's hands danced over the console, relaying her command. Clitheran flankers moving in, Dornai mines primed. The outpost's surface erupted in chaos as human fighters, sleek, jagged craft patched from necessity, surged from concealed hangars. Their engines flared, a dull pulse echoing through the moon's thin crust, the air tinged with the bitter edge of fuel exhaust. Voss's lips curled faintly, not a smile, but a predator's baring of teeth. They walked right in. Chen glanced up, his wiry frame taut. Vargan's shields are holding barely. They didn't expect this volume. They never do, Voss shot back, her gaze unyielding. Hit them harder. In the void, the Vargan vanguard reeled under the onslaught. Their shields shimmered, absorbing the barrage, but cracks spider-webbed through their formations as human fighters darted in erratic arcs, striking and vanishing like phantoms. The Clitheran flankers, stealthy, needle-thin ships, slipped through the gaps, sowing confusion with pinpoint strikes, while Dornai mines detonated in silent blooms of light, shredding hulls with ruthless efficiency. On the Eclipse, the command deck jolted, the floor trembling as reports flooded in. Trelk's voice cracked, his composure fraying. "Chancellor, they've got ambushes, fighters, mines, guns we didn't see." Vorax's claws raked the console, leaving faint gouges. "Impossible. Our scans were wrong," Trelk cut in, his markings dimming. "They're countering us, fast." "Countering?" Vorax's tone turned icy, his eyes blazing. "Then adapt. Tighten the line. Sweep them out." The vanguard shifted, their sleek forms pivoting to chase the human swarm. But the humans didn't hold ground. They struck and faded, dragging the Vargan deeper into the mire. The deck's air thickened with the sharp whiff of burning relays, the systems straining to track the chaos unfolding beyond the viewport. In the shuttle, Zakar watched the battle ignite, his chest tight with a mix of grim satisfaction and coiled dread. The heads-up display flared with markers, Vargan ships faltering, human forces pressing. "They're bleeding," he rasped, his voice low. Krell's claws twitched on the controls, his tone cautious. "Not enough. The vanguard still intact." "For now," Zakar said, his mandibles clicking faintly. "Voss knows how to twist the knife." He activated the comms link, the static crackling like distant thunder. "Voss, it's Zakar. Their left flank's lagging. Comms are choking. Hit there now." Her reply came swift, sharp as a blade. "Already on it, old scale. You seeing this?" "Every scar," Zakar growled. "Keep them guessing." The link cut, and Zakar leaned back, his scales rasping against the seat. The display showed the human counterattack tightening, fighters weaving through the Vargan line, mines blooming in calculated bursts. He could feel the shift, not a tide, but a noose drawing taut. On the outpost, Voss tracked the same chaos, her sharp eyes flicking between the display and her crew. The room thrummed with the dull pulse of machinery pushed to its limits, the air heavy with the tang of sweat and scorched circuits. "Clitherans, flank left," she ordered, her voice slicing through the din. "Dornai, tighten the minefield. Box them in." Chen relayed the commands, his fingers a blur. "They're scrambling, Admiral. Shields are buckling on their lead ships." "Let them scramble," Voss said, her tone cold. "They wanted a fight. They'll choke on it." Beyond the viewport, the Vargan vanguard staggered, their once unified thrust fracturing under the human assault. A lead ship erupted in a silent flare, its hull torn apart by a Dornei mine, debris spinning into the dark like shattered teeth. The humans pressed harder, their jagged fighters diving through the gaps, relentless and unforgiving. On the Eclipse, Vorax gripped the console, his claws trembling with barely contained fury. "Regroup!" he roared, his voice a thunderclap. "Pull them back! Now!" Trelk hesitated, his scales paling. "Chancellor, if we retreat—" "We don't retreat!" Vorax snarled, cutting him off. "We reposition! Get me control!" The deck shuddered as the vanguard struggled to comply, their movements sluggish under the human barrage. Vorax's gaze burned into the display, Zakhar's warnings clawing at the edges of his mind. He shoved them down, but the doubt lingered, a splinter under his scales. In the shuttle, Zakhar watched the Vargan line bend, his breath shallow. "They're cracking," he murmured, almost to himself. Krell's markings flared faintly, his voice tight. "Not breaking yet. They'll hit back." "Let them try," Zakhar said, his amber eyes hard. "This is just the spark." Zakhar's shuttle lingered at the battlefield's edge, its hull a muted flicker against the void's unyielding shadow. Inside, the cabin glowed with the restless light of laser plasma displays, their shifting patterns etching lines across his weathered scales. He watched the Vargan vanguard reel under the human onslaught, their sleek forms fracturing like glass under a hammer. His mandibles clicked faintly, a dry echo in the stillness as Krell's warning hung heavy. "They'll hit back." "Let them try," Zakhar had rasped, his voice a blade's edge. "This is just the spark." But now, as the clash swelled, he felt the ember flare into something fiercer. "They're digging in," Krell said, his claws tapping the controls with restrained urgency. His markings pulsed dimly, a shadow of doubt threading his tone. The vanguards pulling together, tightening their grip. Zakhar's amber eyes narrowed, locked on the display. "They're clawing for control. Won't last." The shuttle thrummed faintly, the subtle pulse of its drives rippling through the seats. The air carried the dry bite of strained filters, laced with the faint warmth of overworked circuits. A brittle lifeline stretched taut. Zakhar's claws tightened on his staff, its scars a silent anchor as he tracked the Vargan ships regrouping, their counterstrike brewing. Aboard the Eclipse of Dominion, High Chancellor Vorax paced the command deck, his towering frame a storm of barely contained fury. The air was thick with the sharp tang of scorched wiring and the hiss of coolant vents laboring to keep pace. His luminous gaze burned into the heads-up displays, where the vanguard's fractured lines struggled to hold against the human swarm. "Full assault! Now!" Vorax roared, his voice a thunderclap splitting the chaos. Commander Trelk scrambled to comply, his scales paling under the strain. "Chancellor, we're redirecting power, bolstering the shields. They're hitting us from every angle." "Then hit back harder," Vorax snarled, his claws raking the console's edge. "Break their spine!" The deck shuddered as the Vargan ships unleashed a barrage, beams of searing energy slashing through the dark to claw at the human fighters. The air sharpened with the bitter whiff of overloaded systems, the displays flaring with markers as the vanguard surged forward, a predator desperate to reclaim its prey. Trelk's voice wavered, his earlier confidence cracking. "They're slipping through. Too fast." "Fast?" Vorax's tone turned venomous, his eyes blazing. "Then chase them down." Below, on the human outpost, the command post thrummed with defiance. The air was heavy with the gritty scent of packed soil and the faint crackle of static from overburdened comms. Admiral Elena Voss stood rooted, her sharp eyes darting across the laser plasma display as the Vargan counterattack ignited. The room pulsed with the dull beat of machinery pushed beyond limits, the crew's movements a blur of focus and grit. "They're pushing," Lieutenant Chen muttered, his wiry frame hunched over the console. Shields are taking the brunt, holding, but not for long. Voss's lips pressed thin, her voice cutting through the din. Good. Let them burn their strength. Signal the Clitherans. Tighten the noose. Chen's fingers flew across the controls, relaying her orders. Dornai mines are resetting. Second wave's ready. The outpost's defenses roared, hidden guns spitting a relentless hail of projectiles while Clitheran flankers danced through the Vargan line, their needle-sharp strikes sowing disorder. Dornai mines bloomed in calculated bursts, shredding hulls with silent fury. Voss watched the display, her gaze unyielding as the Vargan advance faltered, their ships caught in a web of chaos. "They're bleeding now," she said, her tone cold as stone. "Keep the pressure. Don't let them breathe." In the void, the battle twisted into a brutal dance. Vargan ships lumbered forward, their shields flickering under the barrage, while human fighters, jagged, relentless, darted through the gaps, striking with savage intent. A Vargan cruiser erupted in a silent flare, its frame torn apart by a Clitheran ambush, debris spinning into the dark like scattered bones. On the Eclipse, the deck jolted again, the air thickening with the sharp scent of burning relays. Trelk's voice rose, edged with panic. "Chancellor, we're losing ground. Their tactics are shifting too quick." Vorax gripped the console, his claws trembling with rage. "How?" he hissed, his gaze locked on the display. "Our numbers don't matter," Trelk cut in, his markings dimming. "They're outflanking us. Mines, fighters, static guns. It's a shredder." "Enough!" Vorax's roar silenced the deck. "Pivot the line. Focus fire on their core. Crush them!" The vanguard shifted, their sleek forms wheeling to target the human outpost. But the humans didn't buckle. They scattered, drawing the Vargan deeper into the fray. The deck systems groaned, the air heavy with the tang of overtaxed machinery as Trelk struggled to track the shifting battlefield. In the shuttle, Zakar watched the chaos unfold, his chest tight with a grim mix of hope and dread. The heads-up display flared with updates, Vargan ships splintering, human forces pressing. "They're overreaching," he rasped, his voice a low growl. Krell's claws stilled on the controls, his tone taut. "They're regrouping. Still got teeth." "Teeth don't bite when the jaw's broken," Zakar shot back, his mandibles clicking sharply. He activated the comms, the static snapping like a whip. "Voss, it's Zakar. They're lunging. Center's exposed. Hit it." Her reply crackled through, swift and biting. "Got it, old scale. We're already there." The link cut, and Zakar leaned forward, his scales rasping against the seat. The display showed the human counterstrike tightening, fighters swarming the Vargan core, mines blooming in deadly arcs. He could feel the tide shifting, not a wave, but a vice clamping shut. On the outpost, Voss tracked the same unraveling, her sharp eyes flicking between the display and her crew. The room thrummed with the pulse of straining systems, the air thick with the bitter edge of sweat and scorched circuits. "Clitherans, center thrust, now!" she ordered, her voice a blade's edge. "Dornai, seal the flanks!" Chen relayed the commands, his hands a blur. "They're buckling, Admiral. Center's cracking." "Let it crack," Voss said, her tone unyielding. "We'll bury them in the pieces." Beyond the viewport, the Vargan line shuddered, their once mighty thrust collapsing under the human assault. A second cruiser flared into oblivion, its hull shredded by a mine's silent wrath, fragments scattering like ash. The humans pressed harder, their fighters relentless, their allies tightening the snare. On the Eclipse, Vorax staggered as the deck shook, his claws gouging the console. "Hold the line!" he bellowed, his voice raw. "We do not yield!" Trelk's scales paled further, his voice a thread. "Chancellor, we're hemorrhaging ships. They're everywhere." "Then fight everywhere!" Vorax snapped, his eyes wild. "Get me dominance!" The deck crew scrambled, their movements frantic as the Vargan fleet fought to regroup. Vorax's gaze burned into the display, Zakar's warnings clawing louder now, a splinter he couldn't ignore. Doubt festered, but he crushed it beneath his will. In the shuttle, Zakar watched the Vargan center buckle, his breath shallow. "They're drowning," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Krell's markings flared faintly, his tone tight. "They'll thrash before they sink." Zakar's amber eyes hardened, his claws flexing. "Let them. It's too late to swim." Zakar's shuttle hovered at the battlefield's rim, its hull a faint shimmer against the void's unyielding dark. Inside, the cabin flickered with the restless glow of laser plasma displays, their light carving sharp angles across his weathered scales. He watched the Vargan fleet flounder, their once mighty center crumbling under the human onslaught, a beast thrashing in a snare. His mandibles clicked faintly, a dry snap cutting through the stillness as Krell's words lingered. "They'll thrash before they sink." "Let them," Zakar had growled, his amber eyes hard. "It's too late to swim." Now, as the tide turned, he felt the weight of that truth settle like stone. "They're fraying," Krell said, his claws twitching over the controls. His markings pulsed dimly, a flicker of tension threading his voice. "But they're not done. Reinforcements are inbound." Zakar's gaze sharpened, locked on the display. "Then we choke them before they arrive." The shuttle thrummed faintly, the subtle pulse of its drives rippling through the floor. The air carried the dry sting of overtaxed filters, tinged with the faint warmth of strained circuits, a fragile thread holding them aloft. Zakar's claws gripped his staff, its worn surface a steady anchor as he tracked the human counteroffensive tightening its grip. Aboard the Eclipse of Dominion, High Chancellor Vorax stood rigid on the command deck, his luminous eyes blazing through the chaos. The air was thick with the sharp tang of scorched wiring and the hiss of coolant vents laboring under the strain. His vanguard staggered on the heads-up displays, their fractured line buckling as human fighters swarmed like vengeful specters. "Reinforcements! Status!" Vorax barked, his voice a thunderclap splitting the din. Commander Trelk scrambled to respond, his scales paling further. "2 cycles out, Chancellor. They're pushing full burn, shields reinforced." "Then hold the line," Vorax snarled, his claws gouging the console's edge. "We do not break." The deck shuddered as the Vargan ships rallied, their beams slashing through the dark to claw at the human swarm. The air sharpened with the bitter whiff of overloaded systems, the displays flaring with markers as the fleet fought to stabilize. Trelk's voice cracked, his composure unraveling. "They're outflanking us again. Mines everywhere." "Outflanking?" Vorax's tone turned icy, his gaze wild. "Then flank them back. Trap them." Below, on the human outpost, the command post thrummed with relentless focus. The air was heavy with the gritty scent of packed earth and the faint crackle of static from overburdened comms. Admiral Elena Voss paced the cramped space, her sharp eyes locked on the laser plasma display as human reinforcements surged into the fray, sleek ships bolstered by Clitheran stealth and Dornai bulk. "Now!" she snapped, her voice a blade's edge slicing through the room. Lieutenant Chen's hands flew across the console, relaying her command. "Reinforcements locked. Clitheran's hitting the rear, Dornai sealing the edges." The outpost's defenses roared anew, hidden guns spitting a storm of projectiles while the fresh wave of human ships dove into the Vargan line. The air pulsed with the dull beat of machinery stretched thin, the scent of sweat and scorched circuits thickening as Voss watched the enemy falter. "They're boxed," she said, her tone cold as iron. "Squeeze." Chen glanced up, his wiry frame taut. "Their reinforcements are closing. Fast." "Let them come," Voss shot back, her gaze unyielding. "We'll bury them too." In the void, the battle shifted into a brutal vice. Human fighters, jagged and relentless, wove through the Vargan ranks, striking with ruthless intent, while Clitheran flankers slipped behind to shred the rear. Dornai mines flared in silent bursts, tearing hulls apart with calculated wrath. A Vargan destroyer erupted in a blinding flash, its frame splintering into the dark like shattered claws. On the Eclipse, the deck jolted violently, the air thickening with the sharp scent of burning relays. Trelk's voice rose, edged with desperation. "Chancellor, they've got us pinned. Reinforcements won't breach in time." Vorax gripped the console, his claws trembling with fury. "Retreat!" he hissed, the word a bitter shard in his throat. "Pull back! Now!" "Retreat?" Trelk's scales flared, his tone cracking. "We can still— Now!" Vorax roared, his eyes blazing. "Or we lose everything!" The vanguard pivoted, their sleek forms wheeling to flee. But the humans pressed harder, their allies closing the gaps. The deck's systems groaned, the air heavy with the tang of overtaxed machinery as Trelk struggled to relay the order through the chaos. In the shuttle, Zakar watched the Vargan retreat falter, his chest tight with grim resolve. The heads-up display flared with updates, human ships tightening the noose, Vargan reinforcements stalling. He activated a secure link, the static snapping like a whip. "Voss, it's Zakar. I'm jamming their comms. Rear's blind. Hit it." Her reply crackled through, swift and sharp. "On it, old scale. You're a ghost in their machine." The link cut, and Zakar leaned forward, his scales rasping against the seat. He tapped into the Vargan comms grid, old codes from the border wars still active, and flooded their rear channels with noise. The display showed the effect. Vargan ships veering off course, their coordination dissolving into static. "They're blind," Krell muttered, his markings flaring faintly. "You're gutting them." "Gutted don't win," Zakar rasped, his mandibles clicking sharply. "Voss'll finish it." On the outpost, Voss tracked the chaos, her sharp eyes flicking between the display and her crew. The room pulsed with the dull throb of straining systems, the air thick with the bitter edge of sweat and scorched wiring. "Clitheron's rear strike. Full burn," she ordered, her voice a whip crack. "Dornai, lock the perimeter." Chen relayed the commands, his fingers a blur. "Their rear's crumbling, Admiral. Comms are down." "Zakar's handiwork," Voss said, her lips curling faintly. "Push. Break their back." Beyond the viewport, the Vargan retreat collapsed. Clitheron flankers tore through the blinded rear, their strikes swift and lethal, while Dornai ships sealed the edges, mines blooming in deadly arcs. A Vargan cruiser flared into oblivion, its hull shredded by a human salvo, debris scattering like ash across the dark. On the Eclipse, Vorax staggered as the deck shook, his claws gouging deeper. "Stabilize!" he bellowed, his voice raw. "Get me a line!" Trelk's scales dimmed, his voice a thread. "Chancellor, comms are scrambled. Rear's gone dark." "Then fight dark!" Vorax snapped, his eyes wild. "Hold them off!" The deck crew scrambled, their movements frantic as the Vargan fleet unraveled. Vorax's gaze burned into the display, Zakar's shadow looming larger, a splinter he couldn't dislodge. The humans weren't just winning, they were dismantling his empire piece by piece. In the shuttle, Zakar watched the Vargan line shatter, his breath shallow. "They're done," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Krell's claws stilled, his tone tight. "Reinforcements are still out there." Zakar's amber eyes hardened, his claws flexing. "Not for long. Voss has them dancing." Zakar's shuttle drifted at the battlefield's fringe, its hull a faint gleam against the void's relentless shadow. Inside, the cabin flickered with the restless light of laser plasma displays, their shifting glow tracing jagged lines across his weathered scales. He watched the Vargan fleet unravel, their shattered remnants clawing for survival as human ships tightened the noose, a predator caught in its own trap. His mandibles clicked faintly, a dry snap cutting through the stillness as Krell's warning lingered. "Reinforcements are still out there." "Not for long," Zakar had rasped, his amber eyes hard. "Voss has them dancing." Now, as the Vargan collapse loomed, he felt the rhythm of that dance turn lethal. "They're scattering," Krell said, his claws hovering over the controls. His markings pulsed dimly, a flicker of unease threading his tone. "But Vorax, he'll lash out before he falls." Zakhar's gaze sharpened, locked on the display. "Let him. It's his last breath." The shuttle thrummed faintly, the subtle pulse of its drives rippling through the seats. The air carried the dry sting of strained filters, laced with the faint warmth of overworked circuits, a brittle thread stretched to breaking. Zakhar's claws gripped his staff, its worn surface a steady tether as he tracked the human forces closing in, relentless and unforgiving. Aboard the Eclipse of Dominion, High Chancellor Vorax stood rigid on the command deck, his luminous eyes wild with defiance. The air was thick with the sharp tang of scorched wiring and the hiss of coolant vents failing under the strain. His flagship trembled on the heads-up displays, surrounded by the wreckage of his fleet, shattered hulls drifting like broken claws in the dark. "Final push! Now!" Vorax roared, his voice a jagged shard splitting the chaos. Commander Trelk scrambled to respond, his scales paling to a ghostly sheen. "Chancellor, systems are failing, shields are down, comms are static." "Then ram them," Vorax snarled, his claws gouging the console's edge. "Break their line or die trying." The deck shuddered as the Eclipse lurched forward, its battered frame diving toward the human swarm in a desperate lunge. The air sharpened with the bitter whiff of overloaded relays, the displays flaring with markers as the flagship barreled into the fray. Trelk's voice wavered, his composure a distant memory. "We're exposed! Humans are everywhere!" "Everywhere?" Vorax's tone turned venomous, his gaze blazing. "Then take them with us!" Below, on the human outpost, the command post thrummed with unyielding focus. The air was heavy with the gritty scent of packed earth and the faint crackle of static from overburdened comms. Admiral Elena Voss stood rooted, her sharp eyes locked on the laser plasma display as the Eclipse charged, a wounded beast bearing its fangs. "They're coming," Lieutenant Chen muttered, his wiry frame taut over the console. "Straight at us. Suicide run." Voss's lips pressed thin, her voice cutting through the din. "Perfect. Signal the trap. Spring it." Chen's fingers danced across the controls, relaying her command. Clitherans in position, Dornai mines armed. The outpost's defenses flared, hidden guns unleashing a storm of projectiles while human ships pivoted with lethal intent. The air pulsed with the dull beat of machinery stretched beyond limits, the scent of sweat and scorched circuits thickening as Voss watched the Vargan flagship plunge into her web. "They're blind," she said, her tone cold as stone. "Finish it." Chen glanced up, his voice low. "They're reinforcements, still closing." "Not in time," Voss shot back, her gaze unyielding. "They're dead already." In the void, the trap snapped shut. Clitheran flankers, stealthy and swift, slipped through the Vargan rear, their strikes carving through weakened hulls, while Dornai mines erupted in calculated bursts, shredding the Eclipse's escorts. Human fighters, jagged and relentless, swarmed the flagship, their salvos tearing into its battered frame. A silent flare lit the dark as a Vargan frigate splintered, its debris scattering like ash across the battlefield. On the Eclipse, the deck jolted violently, the air thickening with the sharp scent of burning systems. Trelk's voice rose, edged with panic. "Chancellor, we're surrounded. Shields gone. Engines failing." Vorax gripped the console, his claws trembling with rage. "Fight!" he bellowed, his voice raw. "We do not bow." The deck crew scrambled, their movements frantic as human commandos breached the hull, their boots scuffing the scarred floors. The air filled with the bitter tang of plasma fire and the faint whiff of blood, the once mighty flagship reduced to a battlefield. Vorax drew a ceremonial blade, its edge glinting in the flickering light, and turned to face the intruders. In the shuttle, Zakar watched the eclipse falter, his chest tight with a mix of grim satisfaction and quiet sorrow. The heads-up display flared with updates, human ships encircling, Vargan reinforcements stalling. He activated the comms, the static snapping like a whip. "Voss, it's Zakar. They're done. You've got them." Her reply crackled through, swift and sharp. "I see it, old scale. Boarding now." The link cut, and Zakar leaned back, his scales rasping against the seat. He could feel the end nearing, not a storm, but a guillotine falling. The display showed human commandos storming the eclipse, their movements swift and unforgiving, a tide Vorax couldn't stem. On the eclipse, Vorax faced the human intruders, his blade raised as commandos poured through the breached deck. The air was thick with the sharp scent of plasma burns and the faint crackle of failing systems. "You'll not take this ship," he roared, lunging forward. A human commando, scarred and steady, met his charge, parrying the blade with a rifle stock. "It's over," she said, her voice low and unyielding. "Stand down." Vorax's mandibles twitched, his eyes wild. "Never," he hissed, swinging again, only to falter as a second commando's shot caught his flank. He staggered, the blade clattering to the floor, and slumped against the console. "They were right," he whispered, his voice a broken thread. "We didn't listen." On the outpost, Voss tracked the boarding, her sharp eyes flicking between the display and her crew. The room pulsed with the dull throb of straining machinery, the air heavy with the bitter edge of sweat and scorched wiring. "They've got him," Chen said, his fingers pausing mid-motion. "Good," Voss said, her tone flinty. "Signal the fleet. Clean up what's left." Beyond the viewport, the Vargan reinforcements arrived. Too late. Human ships and their allies turned on the newcomers, their strikes swift and relentless, shattering the last hope of a Vargan rally. The eclipse hung dead in the dark, its lights flickering out like a dying ember. In the shuttle, Zakar watched the collapse, his breath shallow. "It's finished," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Krell's markings dimmed, his tone soft. "They didn't see it coming." Zakar's amber eyes hardened, his claws flexing. "Number, and that's why they lost." Zakar's shuttle lingered at the battlefield's edge, its hull a faint shimmer against the void's unyielding dark. Inside, the cabin glowed with the fading light of laser plasma displays, their restless flicker softening across his weathered scales. He watched the Vargan fleet's remnants drift, shattered husks spinning silently, a graveyard of arrogance laid bare. His mandibles clicked faintly, a dry snap breaking the stillness as Krell's words hung heavy. They didn't see it coming. "No," Zakar had rasped, his amber eyes hard, "and that's why they lost." Now, as the silence settled, he felt the weight of victory, not a roar, but a quiet blade sheathed. "They're gone," Krell murmured, his claws resting on the controls. His markings pulsed dimly, a shadow of relief threading his tone. Nothing left but echoes. Zakar's gaze lingered on the display, the markers of Vargan ships fading into static. Echoes teach lessons, if anyone's left to hear. The shuttle thrummed faintly, the subtle pulse of its drives rippling through the floor. The air carried the dry sting of strained filters, tinged with the faint warmth of cooling circuits, a lifeline winding down. Zakar's claws loosened on his staff, its worn surface a steady anchor as he traced the human fleet's withdrawal, their allies trailing like sentinels in the dark. Aboard the human flagship Defiant Dawn, Admiral Elena Voss stood on the bridge, her sharp eyes sweeping the heads-up displays. The air was thick with the gritty scent of sweat-soaked uniforms and the faint hiss of overtaxed vents winding down from battle. The eclipse of Dominion hung lifeless beyond the viewport, its broken frame a monument to Vargan folly, surrounded by the scattered debris of their reinforcements. "Final strike's done," Lieutenant Chen said, his wiry frame slumping slightly over the console. Clitherans and Dornai are pulling back, mopping up stragglers. Voss nodded, her voice cutting through the room's quiet. Good. Signal Earth. Vargan threats neutralized. The bridge thrummed with the dull pulse of machinery easing off, the air sharpening with the bitter tang of scorched wiring as the crew exhaled the tension of hours past. Voss's gaze lingered on the display. The Vargan flagship's last stand replaying in her mind, Vorax's fall, a whisper of defiance snuffed out. "They thought us prey," she murmured, her tone cold as stone. Chen glanced up, his voice low. "They won't make that mistake again." "They won't get the chance," Voss shot back, her eyes narrowing. "This ends their reach." In the void, the human fleet regrouped, their jagged ships and allied vessels forming a loose arc, victors claiming the silence. Clitheran flankers slipped into the shadows, their stealth a quiet promise, while Dornai hulks lumbered back, their minds spent, but their presence a lingering threat. The battlefield stilled, its fury spent, leaving only the husks of Vargan ambition spinning aimlessly. On the Eclipse, human commandos secured the deck, their boots scuffing the scarred floors as they bound Vorax and his surviving officers. The air was heavy with the sharp scent of plasma burns and the faint whiff of blood, the once proud command center reduced to a tomb. Vorax knelt, his luminous eyes dim, his ceremonial blade confiscated, a fallen titan stripped bare. "You've won," he rasped, his voice a broken thread as a commando loomed over him. "What now?" The commando, scarred and steady, met his gaze, her tone unyielding. "Now you live with it. Tell your kind what happens when you underestimate us." Vorax's mandibles twitched, his defiance a flicker drowned in defeat. The commando turned away, her squad hauling the prisoners toward the shuttles, leaving the Eclipse to its silent grave. In the shuttle, Zakar watched the aftermath unfold, his chest tight with a bitter mix of triumph and weariness. The heads-up display dimmed, its updates slowing. Human victory sealed, Vargan remnants contained. He activated the comms, the static crackling like a dying ember. "Voss, it's Zakar. You've got them. Clean sweep." Her reply broke through, swift and sharp. "Thanks to you, old scale. Your intel turned the tide." "Yours cut the throat," Zakar growled, his mandibles clicking faintly. "What's next?" "Rebuilding," Voss said, her tone softening but firm, "and reminding the galaxy we're not to be crossed." The link cut, and Zakar leaned back, his scales rasping against the seat. He could feel the shift, not a storm's end, but a new horizon dawning. The display showed the human fleet withdrawing, their allies in tow, a new order taking root amid the wreckage. On the defiant dawn, Voss turned from the display, her sharp eyes sweeping her crew. The bridge pulsed with the dull throb of systems winding down, the air thick with the earthy scent of exertion and the faint crackle of cooling machinery. "Clitherans want a council," Chen said, his fingers pausing mid-motion. "Dornai too, talk of terms." "Let them talk," Voss said, her voice a blade's edge. "We've earned the table." Beyond the viewport, the battlefield faded into quiet. The Vargan threat a memory etched in broken hulls. Earth's forces stood tall, their fury unleashed and their strength proven, a beacon to those who dare challenge them. Voss folded her arms, her gaze distant but resolute. "This isn't the end," she murmured, more to herself than the crew. Chen tilted his head, his tone cautious. "What is it then?" "The start," Voss shot back, her eyes hardening. "They'll remember this day." In the shuttle, Zakar stared at the void, his breath shallow. The heads-up display flickered out, leaving only the stars, cold, unblinking witnesses to the fall of an empire. "We did it," Krell said, his voice soft but steady. "No," Zakar rasped, his amber eyes distant. They did. We just lit the fuse. Krell's markings flared faintly, his claws flexing on the controls. And now? Now we watch, Zakar said, his tone heavy with reflection. Humanity's awake. The galaxy won't sleep easy. The shuttle turned from the battlefield, its course set for the rim, a silent observer to the dawn breaking over human space. Zakar's thoughts drifted, not to the victory, but to the cost, the scars, the future waiting beyond the dark. He'd warned his people and they'd paid in blood. Now humanity stood as a force undeniable, their fury a lesson carved into the stars. On Earth, the news rippled through command posts and colonies alike. Vargan defeated, humanity triumphant. Alliances solidified, the Clitherans and Dornai stepping into a fragile pact, their grudges buried under shared survival. Voss's voice carried through the channels, a quiet command to prepare, not for war, but for what came after. In the shuttle, Zakar closed his eyes, the faint pulse of the drives a steady beat against his scales. It's theirs now, he murmured, his voice barely audible. Krell glanced over, his tone soft. And us? Zakar's mandibles twitched, a faint smile tugging at his jaw. We fade. They rise.